this day. But officially, how did the war end?
So officially, the war ends at Appomattox in the early spring of 1865, when Grant has pretty much smashed Robert E. Lee's army. Appomattox Courthouse is a small town in Virginia, and the two men meet, and they're portraits of this as a painting of it we have in the book. And Grant and Lee sign a paper which basically allows Lee's soldiers to leave the battlefield and leave with their sidearms to go back home. That's pretty much the end. Jefferson Davis, who's the president of the Confederacy, goes into hiding. He's later captured and then not convicted. But there's no formal settlement in the way there is at the end of World War II, where they meet in Yokohama Bay, the U.S. and Japanese leaders, and sign that. This is not that.
So what stands out to you as brilliant ideas during this time and actions too of Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln?
So I mentioned that his values. I think a number of the things that he does that are quite extraordinary. First, in emancipating the slaves. Now, the slaves were freeing themselves, but Lincoln recognizes that he needs more labor in the Union Army, and he recognizes that there's still a lot of resistance. And what he does is he makes the case for freeing the slaves based on the argument, not just of the moral value of that, but based on how that will benefit the North. He's able to convince non-abolitionists to pursue abolitionist policies that by serving their own interests. What he's basically saying by 1863 or 64 is, I can ask for more white soldiers, or I can bring in former slaves. Would you like me to take your son, or would you like me to put in? Yeah. It's the same thing Franklin Roosevelt does during World War II. He says, we need to build more planes and more tanks, and I'm sending all the soldiers off to Europe. I've got all this African-American population in the South. Wouldn't you like me to move them up to Chicago so we can win this war and build things in the factories? So Lincoln uses the war to move the country forward morally, even if at times he's convincing people by using other reasons. And I think that's great politics.
I guess that's one of the components of great leadership is is do the right thing for the wrong reasons. or publicly sounding wrong reasons. Yeah.
Find ways to move people. What we talked about before. Mm-hmm. Different stories move different people. So you can tell different stories. He tells one set of stories to the religious leaders who are abolitionists and a different set of stories to the New York bankers. And that's leadership. You tell different kinds of stories to move people to a new position. The other thing Lincoln is really brilliant at is managing the international side of this. So one of the real dangers for the Union is that the British will come in on the side of the Confederacy. The Confederates expected the British would, because again, the Confederates were selling all their cotton to Britain. Mm-hmm. And they knew that the British leadership, first of all, was very happy to work with slaveholding societies, even though they didn't have slaves. And number two, that they believed the Union was getting too strong and threatening the British in Canada. Mm-hmm. So there were many reasons the British might have gone in with the Confederates. Lincoln mixes sticks and carrots with the British. He threatens them. And when the British actually try to send diplomats to negotiate with Southerners, he interdicts that. He basically initiates a quarantine of the South. On the other hand, he reaches out to them and tries to show that he wants better relations and makes the argument that they will actually benefit more from having the industrial capability of the Union on their side. So he's a very good diplomat.
He is considered to be one of the great presidents in the history of the United States.
Yes.
Are there ways that he failed? Is there things he could have done better?
So he failed in the ways that most great leaders fail, which is that he had a terrible succession plan. His vice president, who I spend a lot of time on in the book, Andrew Johnson, who is probably our worst president ever, Andrew Johnson had no business being anywhere near the presidency. Andrew Johnson was the only Southern senator who did not secede. And so even though he was a Democrat, Lincoln wanted to show that he was creating a unity ticket when he ran for re-election in 1864. This happens today, right? So he put someone on as vice president who he didn't even like, but who he thought was politically useful. Problem is, when Lincoln was assassinated, this guy took over. Andrew Johnson was drunk at his own inauguration. The guy was a true drunkard. He was not prepared to lead in any sense, intellectually, politically, and he was against most of the principles Lincoln was for. And the irony is that when Lincoln is assassinated in April of 1865, Andrew Johnson takes over and he has all the war powers Lincoln had. That was not good planning by Lincoln. And we can look back on it now and say, even though Lincoln is the first president who was assassinated, he should have known that there were people coming for him. It wasn't inevitable that he'd be assassinated, but he should have had a backup plan for who would take over, hopefully someone who was capable of doing the job, and Andrew Johnson was not capable.
So for me, from a personal, if I were to put myself in Lincoln's shoes or any leadership position shoes, it is difficult to think about what happens after my death, after I'm gone, right? To plan well. But at the same time, if you care about your actions to have a long-term impact, it seems like you should have a succession plan that continues on the path, continues to carry the ideals that you've implemented. So I'm unsure why people don't do that more often. Like, I wonder how much Vladimir Putin spends percentage of time per day thinking what happens after he's gone to help flourish the nation and the region that he deeply cares for. I wonder, and it's the same as for other presidents, Donald Trump, Joe Biden. They might think politically, like, how do I guarantee that it's another Democrat or a Republican? But do they think like visionary for the country? I don't know. I wonder.
I think that's very rare. And I think what I understand from the literature among business people who talk about this a lot is what ends up happening is you become so powerful, you assume you're always going to be in power. You convince yourself of that. You convince yourself that the end is far away. And of course, for Lincoln, the end could have been far away. He was healthy. He was only in his 50s. He could have lived a lot longer. But it ended fast as it could. And my understanding is that most Americans don't prepare their wills and estates, and it doesn't matter whether they're rich or poor. They assume things are just going to go on because it's not fun to think about this.
Yeah. But I feel like it's freeing. Like, you know what I did, which is interesting? Well, before I went to Ukraine, I recorded a video. I set up a whole thing where I record a video, like, what happens if I die? I record a video to release, and I gave my brother access to my passwords. And I gave him instructions. You're not allowed to look at this, but please publish this if I die. And that made me, it sounds silly and ridiculous, but that made me feel free to do the best thing I want to do. It's like, it's a liberating. So, like, I guess that's for your will, but also, like, do the best possible damn job you can. I feel like as a leader, having a plan, what happens if you die, if you, or you lose some of the some of the power, some of the momentum that is driving you currently, that there's going to be a handoff where you will still be remembered as a great man or woman
But you identify one of the other problems, right? Which is one of the other reasons why someone like Lincoln or certainly Henry Kissinger doesn't create a successor, because you're afraid they're going to steal your passwords. You're afraid they're going to steal the power from you.
That's true.
You had to find someone, your brother, hopefully, who you could trust.
No. But let's just be clear. I love my brother, but he's a troll. So so there's a feature on on whatever password manager I may or may not use, and there's a bunch of services like this. It's interesting. I don't know if you know about this. I've learned about all of this. Is you can have them request access, and it's going to wait 30 days before it gives them access. So it's kind of has this built-in trust trust padding, but it's interesting. I mean, to me, on that aspect, is just to have a plan in all aspects of life. This is for leadership in your private life. Like, what happens to not just your will and your wealth or whatever, but what happens to other stuff like social media and all of that,
right?
In this digital world,
and anything you care about, if you want it to live on, and that's the problem. But unless you can devise a technical solution like that, you have to give someone power now.
Yeah, and that's the tricky thing. I mean, democracy is a kind of technology. You kind of have to figure out how to do it correctly, how to have that power propagate, and especially during war, how you get everybody together into this warmongering mood, and then how do you like come down from that and just relax?
Precisely.
So in some sense, that's with Andrew Johnson. That was the problem is the over centralization of power.
It was the over centralization of power, but it was also that Lincoln had a designated successor who was going to do and tried to do everything that ran against what Lincoln was doing. And it set the country back. We went